Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. Everything I'm about to tell you is based on stories passed down to me by my grandfather. The names of the characters in this story have been changed for privacy, but the events, well, some things you just can't make up. It was late June of 1968 when my grandfather, Sergeant David Harper, was stationed deep in the heart of Vietnam with his unit. The war had taken a heavy toll on everyone, but their next assignment would test not just their courage, but their sanity. It began on a hot and humid morning. The air was thick with the smell of wet foliage and the distant hum of choppers. In the briefing room, Harper and his squad of 12 men gathered around Captain Monroe. The map on the table displayed 3 critical points deep in the enemy's territory. They were tasked with the patrol mission: find a hidden enemy base, gather intelligence, and call in airstrikes for a complete takedown. We're looking for the NVA base, suspected to be somewhere in these coordinates, Monroe said, pointing to 3 locations on the map, each deeper into the jungle than the last. Recon has been scarce in this area, and it's critical that we eliminate this threat. You'll have to move silently and carefully. If you encounter resistance, engage, but our priority is locating their base. The squad, consisting of hardened veterans like Corporal Tanner, Private Evans, and Specialist Diaz, nodded in unison. They had been through hell before, but this mission carried a strange weight and undercurrent of dread no one could shake. By early afternoon, they were packed and ready. The jungle stretched out before them, dark and foreboding. Thick trees, tangled vines, and the constant hum of insects formed an oppressive atmosphere. The dense canopy above allowed only spakes of sunlight to break through, casting eerie shadows on the ground below. As they trekked deeper, Harper noticed something odd. There was no sign of life, no birds, no animals, just an unsettling quiet. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, felt like an invasion of some unseen presence. 2 hours in, they reached the first point, an empty clearing with no sign of enemy activity. Maybe intel was wrong, Tanner muttered. But Harper felt it too, the gnawing sensation of being watched. They pushed on toward the second point, and that's when they found it a village. Or at least, what was left of one. Huts stood abandoned, their thatched roofs caved in. The air was thick with decay, as if the jungle had swallowed the village whole, reclaiming it as its own. Weird, no signs of recent occupation, Diaz muttered, peering into one of the dilapidated huts. I don't like this, Evans said, his voice betraying his nerves. Feels wrong, but orders were orders. Harper motioned for the group to split up and search the area. They needed to be sure there were no enemy soldiers hiding. As they moved through the village, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. Shadows moved at the corner of his vision, but whenever he turned, there was nothing. It was as if the jungle itself was alive, watching their every step. The deeper they went, the darker and more oppressive the air became. Private Evans was the first to break the silence. Sir, I swear I saw something. Out there, he pointed toward the tree line, where thick mist had begun to settle between the trees. There was someone or something moving. Stay alert, Harper ordered, though inside, he'd have felt the creeping unease. This village wasn't abandoned by choice, it felt cursed, like it had been left in haste or terror. As the sun began to dip behind the thick canopy, the squad prepared to move out toward the third point, deeper into the jungle. But just as they were about to leave, a low, mournful wail echoed through the trees, stopping them dead in their tracks. What the hell was that? Diaz whispered, gripping his rifle tightly. Sounded like screaming. Harper muttered, scanning the tree line. His heart raced, and a cold sweat dripped down his back. Stay close, we're moving out now. The air around them grew colder, and the mist thickened as they trudged toward the third point. Every step felt heavier, every breath more labored, as if the jungle itself was weighing down on them pushing them toward the darkness. Little did they know, the true horror had only just begun. The jungle wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it watched us. Every step deeper into its heart felt like stepping further from reality. But we were soldiers, we had a mission. As they pressed forward into the thick jungle, the atmosphere grew darker and more oppressive. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and the temperature dropped suddenly, an odd occurrence for the humid Vietnamese jungle. Sergeant Harper and his squad moved in tight formation, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the dense undergrowth. They were on their way to the third checkpoint, a location rumored to be close to enemy positions. But the tension between the men wasn't just about the mission anymore. Something unspoken gnawed at all of them. "Feels like something's watching us," Private Evans muttered, barely audible to the others. "You feel it too?" Diaz asked quietly, gripping his rifle tighter. His usually calm demeanor had been replaced by an edge of uncertainty. "Keep moving," Harper said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We've got a mission to complete." The squad trudged on, but every few minutes, one of them would stop, glance over their shoulder, or pause to listen to the eerie silence around them. No animal sounds, no distant hum of life, just the faint rustle of leaves and the ever-present mist clinging to the ground. It was as if the jungle had swallowed all noise, leaving them in an unnatural quiet. As they approached the third checkpoint, Harper noticed something strange. The trees were older, larger, their trunks covered in a thick layer of moss and vines that seemed almost to pulse in the dim light. The air grew colder still, and the men instinctively huddled closer together, rifles at the ready. Something wasn't right. "There it is," Corporal Tanner said, pointing ahead to a small clearing. The third checkpoint was supposed to be an old supply drop area used by both sides, now long abandoned. As they entered the clearing, Harper immediately noticed the remnants of a structure, crates, scattered supplies, but all of it seemed untouched, as if it had been waiting for them. Harper signaled for the men to spread out and search the area. As they did, a low, barely audible whisper began to echo through the trees. "What the hell is that?" Evans whispered, his voice trembling. "You hear that?" The others stopped, listening carefully. The whisper grew louder, but it wasn't in any language they understood. It was like the jungle itself was speaking to them, warning them. Harper's heart began to pound in his chest as the whispers morphed into faint cries, then into a chorus of ghostly voices. "It's coming from the trees," Diaz said, pointing toward the thick canopy overhead. "No," Harper corrected, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's coming from everywhere." Suddenly, Specialist Wright, one of their most experienced men, bolted up right from where he was inspecting a crate. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with terror. "I saw them," he gasped, "in the trees. Faces watching us." Before Harper could respond, a cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, and the trees seemed to groan under its weight. Shadows moved unnaturally along the ground, stretching and twisting as if they had a life of their own. "We need to move," Harper barked, regaining his composure. "Now!" But just as they prepared to leave, Private Evans let out a scream. He was standing near the edge of the clearing, staring down at something. Harper rushed over, his stomach twisting with dread. There, half buried in the earth, was a body. Not an enemy soldier, but one of their own, a member of another patrol that had gone missing weeks earlier. The man's eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. "What the hell happened here?" Tanner asked, his voice shaking. Harper didn't answer. He knelt by the body, feeling the cold grip of fear tightening around his chest. The body looked untouched by decay, as if the man had died only moments ago. But that couldn't be possible. "There's more," Diaz said quietly, pointing deeper into the jungle. "There are more bodies." Harper turned to see the others gathered around, several more figures lying in the underbrush, each one with the same horrified expression. The jungle had become a graveyard, and they were standing in the middle of it. "We're getting out of here," Harper said, standing up and motioning for the squad to gather their things. This place isn't right. But as they began to move, the jungle itself seemed to close in around them. The path they had taken to get here was gone, swallowed by the mist, and the whispers, they were louder now, almost deafening, as if whatever haunted this place was getting closer. Harper's heart raced as he led his men back the way they had come, but with each step, the jungle seemed to shift and change. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes, and the air grew colder with every breath. The village they had passed through earlier seemed impossibly far away now, as if the jungle was deliberately trying to keep them from escaping. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, echoing through the trees. It wasn't human. The squad froze, gripping their rifles tightly, eyes darting around for any sign of movement. But the scream didn't come again. Instead, the jungle fell into an eerie silence, as if it was waiting. "We need to keep moving," Harper whispered, though his voice felt hollow in the oppressive quiet. "Whatever's out here, we don't want to meet it." As they pressed on, Harper could feel at the presence of something watching them from the darkness. Something ancient and malevolent, hidden deep within the jungle's heart, and they were walking right toward it. The oppressive silence wrapped around the squad as they pushed deeper into the jungle, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation. Every step felt heavier, as if the jungle itself was resisting their presence. Sergeant Harper led the way, his eyes scanning the overgrown path ahead, while the rest of the men followed, rifles gripped tightly, their movements tense and uncertain. Harper's mind raced with a mixture of fear and confusion. The bodies they had found at the clearing haunted him. They had been members of their own platoon men who had been listed as missing in action for weeks. But the condition of their corpses was unnatural, as if time had frozen the moment of their deaths. And the whispers, those strange, disembodied voices. It was as if the jungle was alive, watching their every move, taunting them. "You think we're lost?" Private Diaz asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper didn't answer right away. He knew better than to show any uncertainty in front of his men, but something was deeply wrong. The path they had been following seemed to shift and twist, as if the jungle was playing tricks on them. "We stick to the plan," Harper finally said, his voice firm. 3 checkpoints, then we call in the airstrike. We're almost at the final location." The squad moved forward, but the atmosphere had changed. The dense foliage seemed to press in from all sides, the trees looming like ancient sentinels. Shadows danced in the corner of Harper's vision, moving just beyond the reach of their flashlights, disappearing the moment he tried to focus on them. The jungle had swallowed them whole, and something was lurking just out of sight. The whispering voices had returned, barely audible at first, but growing louder as they advanced. They seemed to come from every direction, mingling with the rustling of leaves and the faint creaking of branches. "Anyone else hearing that?" Corporal Tanner asked, his eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. "Yeah," Diaz muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's been following us since the clearing." Harper felt it too. The sensation of being watched had grown stronger, as if countless unseen eyes were fixed on them, waiting for the right moment to strike. His gut told him to turn back, to get the hell out of this cursed jungle. But orders were orders. They had to complete the mission. The group came to a sudden halt as Private Evans, who had been walking point, raised his hand. "There," he whispered, pointing ahead. In the dim light filtering through the canopy, they could make out a structure in the distance, an abandoned village, its wooden huts half hidden by the jungle's encroaching vines. The final checkpoint, Harper signaled for the squad to fan out and approach cautiously. As they entered the village, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air grew even heavier, almost suffocating. The huts were in ruins, their walls crumbling, roofs caved in. But something about the place felt wrong. "It's too quiet," Diaz muttered, his eyes scanning the empty buildings. No signs of life. Wright added, crouching beside the remnants of a fire pit. "Hasn't been used in a long time." Harper moved to the center of the village, where a large, twisted tree stood, its roots tangled and gnarled like the veins of some ancient creature. There was something unsettling about the way the branches stretched toward the sky, almost like skeletal fingers. As he knelt to examine the ground, he noticed something strange, symbols carved into the dirt, arranged in a circular pattern around the base of the tree. They weren't military markings. They looked older, primitive, and unfamiliar. Harper reached out to touch the carvings, but a sudden chill ran down his spine. "Don't touch it," Wright warned, his voice tense. Harper pulled his hand back, feeling the weight of the warning. "What is it?" "Looks like some kind of ritual site," Wright replied, his face pale. "I've seen this kind of thing before, in some of the villages we passed through. The locals, they believed in spirits. They'd leave offerings, perform rituals to keep the dead from wandering." "Great," Diaz muttered. "Just what we need. A haunted village." Suddenly, a low, guttural moan echoed through the trees. The men froze, their eyes wide, hearts pounding. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, deep, hollow, as if it came from the earth itself. Harper's grip tightened on his rifle. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm, but inside, fear gnawed at him. The squad began to retreat, but before they could make it out of the village, another sound stopped them in their tracks. This time, it was a voice distinct and human, but it was speaking in Vietnamese, the words slow and deliberate. Harper turned, his blood running cold. Standing at the edge of the village, just beyond the tree line, was a figure. It was barely visible through the mist, but it was unmistakably a man. He wore the uniform of an NVA soldier, but his face was wrong. It was pale, gaunt, and twisted, as if his flesh had been stretched too tightly over his skull. The figure stared at them with hollow, sunken eyes, his mouth moving slowly as he repeated the same phrase over and over again. "What's he saying?" Evans asked, his voice shaking. Harper's blood turned to ice as he realized what the figure was saying. "He's telling us to leave," Harper whispered. "He's saying we're trespassing." The figure began to move closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on Harper, and then, without warning, he stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the jungle, the whispers, and the figure's rasping breath, and then he vanished. "Go," Harper shouted, pushing his men forward. "We're leaving. Now!" They ran, crashing through the underbrush, hearts racing, the jungle closing in around them. But no matter how fast they ran, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The jungle had claimed this place, and it wasn't about to let them leave without a fight. The whispers grew louder, the air colder, shadows moved in the trees, and the oppressive weight of the jungle bore down on them with every step. Harper's lungs burned as he pushed forward, but the fear gnawing at his chest was stronger than the pain. As they fled, he couldn't help but wonder, what had they just seen? Was it real? Or was the jungle playing tricks on them, feeding off their fear? One thing was certain, though, they had been warned, and whatever was watching them wasn't done with them yet. Harper's squad moved through the dense foliage, breathing heavily from the retreat. The jungle, which had once felt like an overwhelming, unfamiliar terrain, now felt a live predator. It seemed to shift and change as they passed, the twisted vines and towering trees warping like they were bending to an unseen will. Harper kept glancing behind them, his senses heightened, every rustle in the leaves sending chills through his body. The village they had just escaped seemed miles away now, yet the haunting presence lingered. "We're heading straight into a nightmare," muttered Corporal Tanner, his voice thick with unease. "That thing back there, I don't know if it was real or if the jungle's getting to us." Private Diaz clutched his rifle tighter, his hand shaking. It was real. Man, that was no trick of the mind. The squid moved in silence for a while, their feet crunching softly on the jungle floor. The oppressive atmosphere made it feel as though the forest was closing in on them, swallowing any sound they made. Every crack of a branch, every movement in the bushes seemed amplified, echoing in their minds. Harper glanced at the map he held. They were still on course for the final rendezvous point, but doubt gnawed at him. They hadn't seen a single sign of enemy activity, not even the telltale sounds of wildlife had accompanied them since they left the village. Instead, there was only the constant feeling of being watched. He scanned the faces of his men, seeing the same anxiety reflected in their eyes. "We'll make it through," Harper said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Stay sharp, we don't have much further to go." But even as he spoke, Harper wasn't sure he believed his own words. As they pushed forward, the jungle grew darker, despite it still being the middle of the day. The thick canopy overhead allowed only slivers of sunlight to penetrate the underbrush, casting long, eerie shadows. The humidity clung to their skin, making it hard to breathe, and the air smelled damp, like the earth itself was decaying around them. "We should have stayed on the main route," Evans muttered under his breath, glancing nervously around. "I've heard stories about this place. Locals say it's cursed." Harper shot him a sharp look. "You're not helping. Focus on the mission." But Evans wasn't alone in his fear. The air had shifted again, the oppressive weight of the jungle pressing down harder than before. The men could feel that something was wrong. They weren't alone. "Anyone else feel like we're not moving?" Diaz whispered, "Like the trees are just." His words were cut off by a sudden sound. It was distant at first, but quickly grew louder, a series of low, guttural growls that echoed from the jungle ahead. Harper motioned for the squad to halt. Everyone froze, gripping their weapons tightly, their eyes darting into the shadows. The growls grew closer, more distinct, and Harper felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Eyes up," Harper whispered. "Stay alert." The jungle seemed to hold its breath for a moment, the silence hanging thick in the air. And then, without warning, the growls stopped, replaced by a low, droning hum that sent shivers through Harper's body. It was a sound unlike anything they had heard before, deep and resonant, like the very ground beneath them was vibrating. Harper Tanner's voice was trembling. "This isn't right." Harper's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the fear gripping his men, threatening to take hold of him as well. But they had a mission. They couldn't turn back now. "We need to move," Harper said firmly. "Keep your heads down and stay close." They pressed on, the strange hum growing fainter as they moved deeper into the jungle. But the sense of being watched never left them. Harper could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the weight of unseen eyes tracking their every step. The jungle was alive, but not in the way they had been trained to understand. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone monument, half covered by vines and moss, its surface etched with strange symbols that Harper didn't recognize. It looked old, far older than anything that should have been in that jungle. "What the hell is this?" Diaz muttered, his eyes wide as he stepped closer to the monument. "Stay back," Harper ordered, feeling a cold dread wash over him. "This isn't what we're here for." As they examined the clearing, the jungle around them seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening unnaturally. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on them like a weight. Harper's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched again, but this time it was more intense, almost unbearable. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of whispering voices. Harper froze, his hand tightening around his rifle. The voices were faint at first, but they quickly grew louder, echoing through the trees like the wind itself was speaking to them. "Do you hear that?" Evans asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper nodded, his pulse quickening. The voices were speaking in Vietnamese, but the words were disjointed, like fragments of a conversation. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. As the wind died down, the whispering voices faded, leaving behind a deafening silence. Harper's heart raced as he glanced at his men, all of them standing frozen, their faces pale with fear. "We need to leave," Harper said, his voice tight. "Now!" But before they could move, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The monument in the center of the clearing seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly. "What the hell is happening?" Diaz shouted, backing away from the monument. Harper didn't have an answer. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something kept him rooted in place. The air around them seemed to thicken, the weight of the jungle pressing down harder than ever before. And then, from the shadows of the trees, figures began to emerge. At first, they were little more than silhouettes, thin shapes moving silently through the dense underbrush. But as they drew closer, Harper could make out their features. They were soldiers and VA, judging by their uniforms, but their faces were twisted and gaunt, their eyes hollow and filled with malice. "Open fire," Harper shouted, raising his rifle. The squad unleashed a barrage of gunfire, the sound echoing through the jungle. But as the bullets struck the approaching figures, they didn't fall. Instead, they kept moving, their twisted faces contorted into grotesque smiles. "Fall back," Harper yelled, his heart pounding in his chest. The squad scrambled to retreat, their gunfire useless against the advancing figures. Harper could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around him as they fled back into the jungle, the haunting whispers following them, growing louder with every step. The jungle was no longer just a battleground, it had become a prison, and something ancient and malevolent was hunting them. The squad ran through the jungle, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Harper's heart pounded like a drum in his ears, his mind racing to process what was happening. The NVA soldiers, if they could even be called that, hadn't fallen to their bullets. No matter how many rounds they fired, the enemy had simply kept coming, moving with an unnatural fluidity, their hollow eyes filled with a malice that defied explanation. Harper led the way, pushing through the thick underbrush as the twisted figures followed, the jungle around them closing in tighter with each step. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, echoing in Harper's mind, filling his head with fragments of strange, alien thoughts. He could hear his men struggling behind him, their voices tinged with panic as they cursed and shouted, firing blindly into the trees. But it didn't matter. Nothing they did seemed to matter anymore. "We can't outrun them," Tanner gasped, his voice high-pitched with fear. "Harper, we're gonna die out here." Harper ignored him, his focus set on finding a way out. His map was useless now, the landscape twisting and warping around them like a living thing. The trees were taller, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. He had no idea where they were or how far they had run, but he knew they had to keep moving. Suddenly, Harper stumbled to a halt, his foot catching on something hard and metallic. He glanced down, his eyes widening as he saw what he had tripped over: a rusted, abandoned NVA helmet, half buried in the dirt. "Wait," Diaz panted as he caught up, his eyes wide with terror. "Where are we?" Harper stared at the helmet, realization slowly dawning on him. This is a battlefield, an old one. The clearing they had run into was littered with the remnants of an ancient fight. Rusted rifles, shattered helmets, and crumbling sandbags lay scattered across the ground, half hidden by the thick vegetation. It was a graveyard, a forgotten relic of a long-ago battle. The oppressive silence of the jungle seemed to deepen, and Harper could feel the weight of unseen eyes on them once again. The squad had stumbled into a place they shouldn't be, a place where the line between the living and the dead had long since blurred. "Stay close," Harper said, his voice low and tense. "This place, it's wrong. We need to." A blood-curdling scream pierced the air, cutting Harper off mid-sentence. It was a scream of pure, primal terror. One of his men, Evans, Tanner shouted, rushing back toward the tree line where the scream had come from. "Wait," Harper yelled, grabbing Tanner by the arm, but it was too late. Tanner broke free and disappeared into the underbrush. Harper cursed under his breath and motioned for the remaining men to follow. They pushed through the dense foliage, the thick vines pulling at their uniforms as if the jungle itself was trying to hold them back. The sound of Evan's scream echoed in Harper's mind, but as they drew closer, it abruptly cut off, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural silence. They found Evans lying in the dirt, his rifle discarded a few feet away. He was curled up, his body shaking violently, his eyes wide and unseeing. Harper crouched down beside him, his pulse racing. "Evans, talk to me," Harper said, his voice urgent. "What happened?" Evans didn't respond. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes darted around, as if he was seeing something that wasn't there, something terrible. Harper shook him gently, trying to snap him out of it, but it was no use. Evans was gone, his mind shattered by whatever horror he had encountered. "We need to move. Harper," Diaz whispered, his voice barely audible. "This place ... it's cursed." Harper knew Diaz was right, but leaving Evans like this felt like abandoning him to whatever evil haunted the jungle. Still, he had to make a decision. "Pick him up," Harper ordered, his voice hoarse. "We're getting out of here." Tanner and Diaz hoisted Evans to his feet, his body limp between them. They started moving again, faster this time, every second spent in the cursed clearing adding to the sense of dread that clawed at Harper's insides. The whispers grew louder as they walked, filling the air with a constant, unintelligible murmur. It wasn't long before they heard another sound, a faint, rhythmic pounding, like the distant thumping of helicopter blades. Harper's heart leapt at the sound of potential rescue, but as they moved toward it, the jungle seemed to grow darker, the trees twisting unnaturally. The sound wasn't coming from any helicopter. The droning hum from earlier returned, louder this time, vibrating through the ground beneath them. Harper could feel it in his bones, an unsettling, low-frequency pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The jungle shifted again, the shadows growing longer, deeper. "We have to go," Tanner screamed, panic taking over as the hum grew louder. "We're being hunted." The squad broke into a sprint, Evans still hanging between them, barely conscious. Harper's legs burned as he pushed forward, his lungs struggling to pull in the thick, humid air. The jungle felt alive around them, closing in with every step, as if it was swallowing them whole. And then they saw the village from before, the one they had fled from hours earlier. But something was wrong. It looked different now. The buildings were twisted, the walls crumbling, and the shadows inside the huts seemed to move, writhing like living things. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. "This isn't real," Diaz muttered, his voice trembling. "This can't be real," but Harper knew it was. The jungle, the village, the twisted NVA soldiers, they were all part of the same nightmare, and there was no waking up. As they entered the village, the air seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping unnaturally fast. Harper's breath came out in visible puffs of mist, and the shadows around them grew darker, denser. "Keep moving," Harper ordered, his voice tight. "We're almost through." But deep down, he wasn't sure they would make it. As they crossed the village square, the droning hum reached a deafening crescendo. Harper looked around frantically, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just the twisted buildings and the dark, empty streets. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Harper saw movement. A figure stepped out of one of the huts, its form cloaked in shadow. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the darkness. But Harper could feel its gaze on him, cold and malevolent. "Run!" Harper screamed, and the squad took off, sprinting toward the edge of the village. But as they ran, the figure moved with them, keeping pace effortlessly, its form shifting and warping as it glided through the shadows. Harper could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around his heart, but he pushed it down, focusing on getting his men out of the village alive. They reached the tree line just as the figure stepped into the light. Harper glanced back for a split second and felt his blood run cold. The figure wasn't human. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and its skin was pale and translucent, like something long dead. "Go," Harper shouted, pushing his men forward. "Don't stop." As they plunged back into the jungle, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling Harper's mind with strange, alien thoughts. He could feel the presence of the entity following them, always just out of sight, always watching, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. Harper's legs burned with exhaustion, his lungs screaming for air as the squad barreled through the jungle. The twisted figure, that had emerged from the village seemed to follow them, always just beyond the edge of the trees, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. It wasn't just the weight of the jungle's heat and humidity that bore down on Harper now, it was the crushing sense of dread that they would never make it out alive. The whispers grew louder with each step, swirling in Harper's mind like a storm, confusing his thoughts. He could no longer tell what was real and what was imagined. The jungle was alive, closing in on them, bending time and space. They had been running for hours, or maybe it had only been minutes. The sun had disappeared completely, though Harper couldn't tell if it was night or if the thick canopy had simply swallowed the light. Behind him, Diaz struggled to keep pace, half carrying Evans, whose legs had given out long ago. Tanner was beside them, his face pale with terror. None of them spoke anymore. There were no words left, only survival, only escape. But Harper knew something they hadn't said aloud. There was no escaping this jungle. It wanted them. The cursed village had marked them, and now the jungle itself was hunting them. The entity, whatever it was, had chosen them as its prey. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and the jungle became eerily silent. The oppressive hum that had followed them for hours vanished, replaced by an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of Harper's neck stand up. "Harper," Diaz gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Something's wrong." Harper slowed, his heart racing. He couldn't hear anything, not even the sounds of the jungle, the insects, or the wind. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on them like a physical force. Then, out of the darkness, the figure appeared again, this time much closer. It stepped into the clearing in front of them, its glowing eyes fixated on Harper. The creature's form was indistinct, its body shifting and flickering as if it was caught between two worlds. It was neither fully human nor fully spirit, something in between, something ancient and malevolent. Harper raised his rifle, though he knew it was useless. The bullets had done nothing before, and they wouldn't help now. His hands trembled as he aimed, his finger hovering over the trigger. "We can't fight it," Diaz muttered, his voice shaking. "It's not real, it's a ghost, or a demon, or something worse." Tanner whimpered beside him, clutching his rifle like a lifeline, but Harper knew the truth. Whatever this thing was, it didn't belong to the living world. They were trespassers in its domain, and it was here to claim them. The creature moved closer, its glowing eyes narrowing, and the jungle seemed to shift around them, closing in tighter. Harper's breath hitched in his throat as the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. "Run!" Harper yelled, but his legs refused to move. The jungle shifted again, twisting and warping, and the creature lunged forward with a speed that defied reason. Harper squeezed the trigger, unloading his rifle, but the bullets passed right through the creature, disappearing into the trees. Harper was knocked to the ground as the figure passed through him, a bone-chilling cold spreading through his chest. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, his heart faltering as icy fingers gripped his insides. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling his head with unintelligible words and images. He saw flashes of the village, the NVA soldiers, the twisted faces of the dead. He saw their tortured souls trapped in the jungle, bound to the land, their lives stolen by the curse that plagued this place. And he saw his own men, the faces of Diaz, Tanner, Evans, caught in the same trap. "No," Harper whispered, his voice cracking. "This can't be how it ends." But deep down, he knew, they were never meant to leave. As Harper struggled to his feet, the jungle shifted again. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, louder than ever, guiding them deeper into the heart of the cursed land. Harper turned to his men, his heart heavy with dread. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice shaking. "We have to keep moving." Diaz nodded, though the terror in his eyes was unmistakable. Tanner was barely holding it together, his hands trembling as he clutched his rifle. Evans was still unconscious, his body slumped over Diaz's shoulder, his breathing shallow. They were running out of time. Harper led the way, his mind racing. The map was useless now, the jungle had twisted beyond recognition. There was no way out, but Harper refused to give in. If they were going to die here, they would die fighting. They pushed forward, the oppressive silence weighing down on them, the whispers growing louder with every step. Harper's heart pounded in his chest, the cold grip of fear tightening around him as they neared the village once again. It had all come full circle. The cursed village loomed ahead, the twisted huts barely visible through the thick fog that had settled over the land. The stench of death hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Harper felt the presence of the entity watching them, its eyes burning into his back. "We need to destroy it," Harper muttered, his mind racing. "The village, it's the source of all this. If we destroy it, maybe we can break the curse." "How?" Tanner gasped, his voice raw with fear. "We don't have anything left." Harper gritted his teeth, his mind searching for a solution. They had no explosives, no air support, nothing that could level the village, but they had to try something. Then, Harper's eyes landed on the radio Diaz's pack, the old, unreliable set they had been using. It was their last chance. "Give me the radio," Harper ordered, his voice firm. Diaz fumbled with the straps, his hands shaking as he passed the radio to Harper. Harper grabbed it, his fingers trembling as he tuned it to the frequency of the nearest air support. "This is Sergeant Harper, calling for immediate airstrike on our position," he said, his voice hoarse. "Coordinates ... are unknown. We're deep in hostile territory. I need bombs on this village. Now." For a moment, there was nothing but static. Harper's heart sank. Was it too late? Were they beyond help? Then, the static cleared, and a crackling voice came through. "Copy that, Sergeant. We've got your position. ETA 10 minutes. Harper felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly crushed by the realization that they still had to survive those 10 minutes. The jungle wasn't going to let them go that easily. "Hold on," Harper said, his voice steady. "We've got air support coming, we just need to hold out." But, as he spoke, the figure reappeared, stepping out of the fog with its glowing eyes fixed on Harper. The temperature plummeted, and Harper's breath turned to mist as the cold washed over him. The jungle began to shift again, the trees warping and twisting, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Harper gritted his teeth, raising his rifle once more. "Come on, you bastard," he shouted. "We're not dying here." The creature lunged at them, and Harper opened fire, his bullets tearing through the fog. Tanner and Diaz fired alongside him, their rifles lighting up the darkness, but it was no use. The creature wasn't of this world, it couldn't be killed. The whispers grew louder, filling Harper's mind, drowning out his thoughts. He could feel the entity closing in, its presence suffocating, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. Then, the ground shook with a deafening roar, and the sky lit up with fire. The airstrike had arrived. Explosions ripped through the village, fire and debris flying into the air as the bombs tore apart the cursed land. Harper felt the shockwave hit him, knocking him to the ground, the heat of the blast washing over him. The whispers stopped, replaced by the deafening sound of the explosions, and then silence. Harper lay on the ground, his body aching, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The jungle was still, the air thick with smoke and ash. The village was gone, reduced to nothing but smoldering ruins. Slowly, Harper pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling. Tanner and Diaz were still standing, though barely, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. Evans lay on the ground, unconscious but alive. They had survived, but just barely. Harper looked around, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the jungle hadn't let them go, not completely. The whispers were gone, but the cold presence of the entity lingered, watching them from the shadows. They had destroyed the village, but the curse of the jungle remained. "Let's get out of here," Harper said, his voice hoarse, "before it changes its mind." Tanner and Diaz nodded, and together, they began the long trek back through the jungle, leaving the cursed land behind. But Harper knew that they would never truly escape. The jungle would haunt them for the rest of their lives, its whispers echoing in their minds, a reminder of the horror they had faced, and the entity, the thing that had haunted them. It was still out there, waiting. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.